Chapter 40, the final chapter in Bentley's Traditions and Encounters, focuses on the last era of the contemporary period, globalization. But before we get to this era in Chapter 40, we need to wrap up the Cold War and discuss how it ended, which is in Chapter 38, and then also discuss Chapter 39, the process of decolonization and what its causes and effects were. This video will talk about the end of the Cold War and also focus on China's changing role in the world during the Cold War. Why did the Cold War end? Because the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, collapsed. This happened for several reasons. First, we'll talk about is that economically the Soviet Union was unable to keep up with its main competitor, the United States. During the 80s, after a period of detente where less military action was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union, and there was a decrease in the buildup of nuclear weapons, spurred on by Ronald Reagan, the Soviet Union and the United States started mass-producing weapons again. And as a result of doing this, because nuclear weapons are not cheap, they're very expensive to produce, the economy took a huge hit, which was already struggling at the time. Also during this time period, the Soviet Union was fighting an expensive proxy war in Afghanistan, where the socialist communist regime that was in power there, the Soviet Union was supporting, was under attack from revolutionaries from the Mujahideen and from the Taliban. Ultimately, this long conflict forced the Soviet Union to pull out of this war because it was so expensive, and eventually the socialist communist state that was running Afghanistan collapses and is defeated by the Mujahideen and the Taliban. So, major economic crisis in the 1980s. Also, going along with this, the two ideas of glasnost and perestroika, these reform movements that were spurred on by Mikhail Gorbachev right here, ushered in a new era of tolerance and discussion in the Soviet Union that had not previously existed. Glasnost, openness is what that word means, was the reform movements that allowed the end of censorship in the Soviet Union and in its satellite nations from the Warsaw Pact, where members of that civilization were able to see past the shroud that separated the East from the West, and were able to see what life was like in those consumerist economies and societies that the United States and the Western European nations lived in. And what they saw, they liked. They wanted to live in a country that allowed them to have consumer products, that allowed them to watch MTV, had Hollywood, that allowed them to have more supply and demand and more of a free market. So when people saw this, they also began to protest. They were allowed to speak out against the government and bring in their ideas. Also part of glasnost was the ability to see what the government did, understand data the government used to make its decisions, and to see behind the curtain of the political body. And so they were able to see those decisions, and most citizens did not like what they saw as far as how the government was acting and its reasons for the decisions that it made. So they spoke out against that. All this speaking out from glasnost, this awareness the citizens finally had, led to perestroika, which is a series of political and economic reforms that redefined what the Soviet Union was. Economically, large businesses that had been under state control were then given to private investors. So they were creating more open markets, less of a command economy. Politically, they installed a legislative body where citizens could elect officials, and the position of president also appeared in the government. They also prohibited, by passing laws, any sort of punishment against citizens of the country who spoke out against the state or who spread information that could be perceived as being negative towards creating a healthy state. So people could now speak out against the country without any sort of punishment. In the past, think Stalin, you spoke out against the country, you'd be killed or sent to a gulag. So this is huge. So glasnost and perestroika, two reform movements that Gorbachev was really forced to kind of put into action because of the major economic crisis that was going on in the Soviet Union, led to a whole host of changes. A big thing that kind of adds on to glasnost and perestroika is that because people were allowed to speak out about their issues with the state from not only the Soviet Union but also its satellite countries, nationalist movements rise up where people create that strong sense of national identity again that we saw in the 19th century, and they revolt and they overthrow their authoritarian governments that were ruining their lives. This happens, a couple examples, in Romania with Nicolae Ceausescu, where he was killed in the 4-day siege. We see it happen in Czechoslovakia, where the Velvet Revolution successfully overthrows the socialist communist regime and puts in a capitalist democratic one. And so these national movements cause satellite nations to break away from what once was the Warsaw Pact, and eventually it also breaks apart the USSR into several republics, the largest of which being the Russian Federation. Those three movements, the people breaking away because they're allowed to protest, because they had a larger say in their government, their country, and in their economy because of Glass's perestroika, and the economic hardships that made these reforms necessary, all led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when that collapsed, that was the largest rival of the United States in this ideological war. And with them removed, it then made socialist, communist governments and economies less prominent around the globe with less support to back them up. And so we see a new world order form where pretty much most global politics and economic decisions are made by countries that have some type of free market system and some type of elected officials and democratic system. And it's headlined by the last remaining superpower in the 1990s, the United States. This has changed since then. In the 1990s, Russia, is very weak. The United States is the lone superpower. But today, China is for sure a superpower, politically and economically. India is a growing, massive superpower. And Russia has found its feet and is also a large superpower. And it's not rare to see these states butt heads with the United States in their decisions, economically and politically. But for the 1990s, a new world order is established. And it is really a society, a global society, where the United States is the front runner, making major decisions. Worth pointing out that the Cold War, this process of going from Stalin to Gorbachev, was a gradual one. In the 40s and the 50s, when Stalin was in rule, we had this oppressive regime of a command economy where the state controlled all economic decisions, and of collectivization and people being persecuted for speaking out. Those persecutions and that extreme command economy are lessened under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev in the 50s and early 60s. This de-Stalinization drops some of Stalin's practices, and they become, I wouldn't say a liberal state, but become less of this command and harsh authoritarian rule. Khrushchev eventually kicked out of office by other Russian rulers because of what was perceived as the failures from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who escalated tension initially, but then through the period of détente and signing of different treaties like the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, SALT II, they were able to lower the amount of nuclear weapons that are created and bring the Cold War, which was at a high boiling point, to a lower simmer. And that leads us to Gorbachev and the reforms that he then experiences. So there's different phases to the Cold War for how Russia is. It's not always this steel curtain that Stalin creates, but at different times it heightens and warms up, and other times it cools down as far as its conflicts with the United States and other NATO nations.